When the storm came that winter morning, Robert didn't think opening his cabin door would turn his whole life upside down. What he discovered shaking on his doorstep would challenge everything he knew about living alone in the wild. Robert was a former history teacher in his 70s who'd lived alone for 15 years in a log cabin he'd built himself, 3 hours from the closest town. Solitude was what preserved his sanity. He was drifting back to sleep when an unusual sound reached his ears, a faint, desperate noise that didn't match the wind rushing through the branches. He stood and shuffled toward the door, feeling icy drafts seeping through every gap. He pulled the door open cautiously, squinting against the dim light and biting wind. Right there on his porch sat a baby bobcat, trembling and barely larger than a common house cat, with ice crystals clinging to its coat and its ears lay flat against its small head. The creature made no sound now, simply sitting there and shivering violently. Robert stared, his pulse quickening in his chest. He understood he shouldn't interfere with wildlife, but this tiny animal appeared nearly frozen solid, completely alone and about to give up. He hesitated for a long moment, uncertain what to do. Then the cub swayed and nearly toppled over, and something inside him took control. He pushed the door wider and moved aside. The small creature paused, then staggered forward on frozen paws. As it entered, Robert noticed movement in the snow past his porch. Another cub. This one could barely move, pulling itself painfully through the heavy snow as though every movement drained its last bit of strength. "Oh, hell," Robert muttered quietly, snatched up his coat and gloves, and hurried toward the struggling cub. It gave out just before he reached it. Using careful hands, he scooped it up, startled by how weightless and delicate it seemed. He turned back toward the heated cabin. Shutting the door firmly behind him, he carried both cubs to the back room where his old wood stove burned steadily. He spread towels across the floor, bundled the cubs carefully, and began slowly massaging warmth back into their small frames. One released a weak whimper, the other lay motionless, though he could detect its chest rising and falling. He stayed beside them for hours, murmuring gently, monitoring their breathing and setting out shallow dishes of water. He moved slowly and quietly, as though any sudden action might frighten the life from them. When Robert extended his hand nearby, the smaller cub pressed its small head against his palm briefly before sleeping again. Only by midday did he allow himself to breathe easier. The cubs had survived. Robert observed them from a short distance, sipping hot tea. He questioned where their mother might be. He also questioned whether he'd just committed an error that would bring nature's fury crashing through his walls. His uncertainty didn't last long. That evening, shortly after darkness swallowed the last daylight, something scraped softly against the back door. Robert went completely still. The sound repeated, quiet, persistent, not panicked. He rose and approached the kitchen window. What confronted him there made his blood freeze worse than any weather could. A mature bobcat stood outside, her fur blanketed with snow, her frame gaunt and quivering. Her eyes reflected the moonlight and blazed golden. She gazed directly at the cabin, ears raised, body crouched and ready. Robert remained motionless. Gradually, he opened the back door a crack. The wind shrieked through the opening. The bobcat didn't snarl or advance. She remained absolutely still, as though expecting something. He retreated, leaving the door partially ajar. From the side room, the cubs released several soft cries. Within moments, the mother reacted, moving with grace and silence. She slipped through the door and headed straight to the room holding her babies. Robert observed from the hallway as she coiled around them, nuzzling and cleaning their heads. They responded immediately, crawling into her warmth. He felt pressure building in his chest, not from fear, but from something far more delicate, a sense of amazement. She hadn't launched an attack. She hadn't fled in terror. She had placed enough trust in him to follow her cubs sent into a human dwelling. He wondered what level of desperation had forced her to permit this. He shut the door softly, not wanting to interrupt them. The following morning, Robert placed several strips of leftover caribou meat on a ceramic dish just outside the bedroom entrance. He wasn't certain she'd accept it, but he recognized that hunting would be brutal with the snow reaching his waist and crusted with ice. Several hours afterward, when he returned, the dish sat empty. The water dish as well. The storm raged for 3 days. Robert maintained the fire, left food and water, and kept a careful distance. By the second evening, something subtle had shifted. The mother bobcat no longer backed away when he approached. She studied him with her amber eyes, calm but watchful. When he spoke softly, she twitched an ear. When he lingered a bit longer, she kept her teeth hidden. Something like understanding existed in her expression, perhaps not trust, but an agreement. Snow climbed high against the cabin's exterior, completely burying the porch stairs. The outside world vanished into a white haze. But indoors, there existed warmth, life, and an unexpected sense of kinship. Robert discovered himself listening for their breathing after dark, the gentle scratching of claws on wood, the faint sound of purring from one of the cubs as it nestled closer to its mother. He slept poorly, not from anxiety, but because he didn't want to miss a single moment. On the fourth morning, the sky broke open in brilliant blue, and stillness blanketed the wilderness. The storm had ended. Light flooded through the windows, sharp and pure, illuminating every particle of dust in the air like drifting stars. Robert positioned himself before the cabin's front door and peered outside. The snow glistened beneath the sun, and everything possessed a strangely sacred quality. When Robert entered that room later, he found it vacant. No evidence remained, only scattered fur and paw prints in the snow trailing back toward the forest. He stood in the doorway for an extended period, his breath clouding in the cold, questioning whether any of it had actually occurred. He knelt slowly, fingertips tracing the faint impression of a paw print stamped into the melted crust of snow just past the threshold. It hadn't been imagination. The fur caught in the blanket existed. The bowls remained thoroughly cleaned. Something holy had moved through his existence and disappeared before it could be completely grasped. That day he didn't start the fire. He simply sat in silence, staring at the door as if anticipating their return. But the bobcats belonged to the wild. They had gone back to their realm, and he stayed in his, two different worlds that had briefly connected like threads drifting in the breeze. Spring arrived slowly and gently. The air softened, carrying faint scents of damp pine and thawed earth. Robert resumed hiking, his camera draped over one shoulder. He hadn't desired to photograph anything in years, but something had transformed. He began searching for traces of the bobcats, finding tracks in the softening mud, tufts of tawny fur on bushes, droppings near hollows. But never the cats themselves. They remained concealed like memories partially forgotten but powerfully felt. Nevertheless, Robert sensed them observing. The hairs on his neck would rise, and he occasionally felt he was being examined from the undergrowth. He talked aloud during those walks, softly and without anticipating any response. "I'm doing well," he would mention. "Thanks for stopping by," or simply, "I've missed you." Then one afternoon in early July, Robert ventured farther than typical, following the climb of a slim ridge. The day proved unusually silent. No bird calls, no rustling, merely the crunch of his boots and the tap of his camera strap. He arrived at a rough slope blanketed with gravel and unstable stones. As he began descending, his boots slipped on a slick section, and he stumbled, arms flailing. He tumbled, striking rock and ice and soil, crashing hard against a frigid rock surface. Agony pierced through his leg like lightning. A moan broke from his lips, forceful, and he attempted to rise, but his ankle collapsed beneath him with a nauseating snap, possibly fractured, certainly more than a twist. The agony proved fierce and unrelenting. He dragged himself to the closest tree, pulling his damaged leg behind him. Each breath brought pain. He braced himself upright and tightened his coat around him, eyes searching the landscape. No phone, no reception, and nobody aware of his location. His heart dropped heavily into his gut. The temperature fell as the sun started its quiet descent beyond the ridge. Darkness spread across the snow like spilled liquid, frigid and advancing. Robert compelled himself to maintain consciousness. He struck his cheeks, rubbed his arms, battled the temptation of sleep that arrived too readily with trauma. Then, precisely as he began slipping from pain and cold, a rustling emerged from the bushes. Distinct, purposeful, not wind, not a small animal. His heart leaped. He rotated his head feebly. It was her, the mother bobcat. She positioned herself several feet distant, silent as falling snow, her fur catching faintly in the fading light. Behind her, two younger bobcats lingered, slender and observant. No longer cubs exactly, not yet fully mature. She advanced slowly and deliberately, testing the air, her attention locked on him. Then she pivoted and began walking away, but paused to glance back at him. Robert made no movement. He physically couldn't, but his lips separated slightly, his breath hitching. She returned, circled him once like a cat examining prey, but there existed no aggression in her movements, only determination. Then she trotted away again, this time with greater speed and clear purpose. He couldn't determine how long he remained there after she vanished. The minutes merged, occupied only with the throbbing in his leg and the faint echo of paws in the snow. He shut his eyes once, perhaps twice, fighting to stay alert. Then a noise. Quiet initially, mechanical, distant. Within 2 hours, the rumble of far-off engines shattered the silence. Then approaching voices, boots crushing snow, shouted names, radios crackling. Then figures materialized through the trees. 2 rescue workers in vivid orange equipment moving rapidly, eyes searching. "Robert Harrison, we received a call from the ranger station," one of them announced. Some hikers noticed animal tracks circling this location strangely and figured something was wrong. One crouched beside him, checking his pulse, draping a thermal blanket across his shoulders. Robert struggled to find words. He felt too exhausted to speak, but his eyes wandered toward the ridge where the bobcat had stood, where she had lingered, where she had looked back once to ensure he noticed her. She had gone. Back at the cabin, leg bandaged and crutches resting beside his chair, Robert reflected frequently on that moment. He never shared the complete truth with anyone. The rescue crew only located him because those tracks had guided them straight to him and circled repeatedly like a marker. And he understood it wasn't chance. It appeared as though she had created a diagram in the snow surrounding his fallen form, like punctuation on a sentence she'd waited months to compose, and miraculously someone had interpreted it. Each evening following that, he would shut his eyes and visualize her face again. Sharp, knowing, timeless, the face of something untamed and noble that had evaluated him, assessed him, and just this once determined he deserved saving. August arrived luminous and abundant. Robert walked the paths near his cabin and often sat on his porch, sketching the mother bobcat from memory. Signs appeared, a half-eaten rabbit near the steps, paw prints around his wood stack, quiet reminders that she hadn't forgotten. One evening at twilight, he glanced up from his notebook and froze. Beyond the clearing stood the mother bobcat, vigorous and composed, her fur gleaming in the fading light. She wasn't alone. Her two offspring, now nearly grown, flanked her, one with a subtle mark above the left eye, the same cub that had first pressed into his palm. She regarded Robert with recognition. He rose slowly, one hand on the porch railing, and simply existed in her presence. "Thank you," he whispered. In that instant, everything else dissolved. The years, the isolation, all that remained was this moment, one man, three wild creatures, and a memory brought to life once more. Then a flick of her tail. She turned and melted into the trees, her children following, elegant and soundless. Robert remained standing long after, his hands gripping the wood, the sky fading from gold to gray. He wasn't ready to go inside yet. He experienced something shifting in his chest, something resembling belonging. He had rescued her children. She had rescued him. And the forest had borne witness to everything. Did you enjoy this story? Would you have opened your door to save those freezing cubs, knowing it could bring a wild mother bobcat to your home? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the story, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.